everybody, thank you for choosing to look at my project for the psychology final. My name is Sarah LaChapelle, and today I want to talk to you about gender, sex, and sexuality. So let's first define the items that we're going to be talking about today. What is sexuality? So the text Sociology, a Global Perspective defines sexuality as an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to others. It also defines it in a sense of identity based on these attractions related to behavior and community membership for those who share the same attractions. Next, what is gender? The same text defines gender as a social distinction between culturally conceived or learned ideals based off of what's appropriate for females and males and according to appearance, behavior, or mental and emotional characteristics. These can include things like hair length, body hair, breast size, leadership roles, or emotional traits just like in women. And lastly, what is sex? The same text defines sex as a biological distinction by your primary sex characteristics, being your sexual organs. These are the anatomical traits that are essential for reproduction. So what do these all have in common and how are they different? What they have in common is they can help to define a person. They can all fall within a spectrum between the traditional binary, and they all have elements of being socially constructed. So let's talk a bit about how Western culture views sex, gender, and sexuality. This image that I'm going to put up on the screen here is what Google search images comes up with when I just typed in the words happy couple. And so what do you see here? I see a lot of couples being all men and women. Majority of them are Caucasian, and the women have long hair, men have short hair, and they seem to be in some kind of intimate physical touch or relationship. So what has helped to shape this Western view our culture has on gender, sex, and sexuality? We tend to have a heteronormative cisgendered view, heteronormative being people attracted to the opposite gender, cisgendered being people identify with the gender they were given at birth. Basically, a lot of the influences that Western culture has for the way that they view these subjects have been influenced by religion. For instance, in Christianity or Judaism, homosexuality has been interpolated to be considered a sin. Sexuality. So there's a lot of different types of sexuality that we have come to know in today's day and age, and it can fall in a continuum spectrum between gay and straight, or it cannot be on the spectrum at all. So some examples of this would be gay, straight, pansexual, meaning you can be attracted to a person itself despite their gender, demisexual, which is a person that can have romantic feelings but only sexual feelings along with romantic feelings, have a lower sex drive, asexual, someone who does not have sexual desires, or bisexual, which is when you can be attracted to both men and women of the traditional gender binary. So what causes sexual orientation? How does a person become gay or straight? So there's no consensus among scientists about the exact reason for an individual's development of being heterosexual, bisexual, or of gay or lesbian orientation, although a lot of research has been examined about the potential genetic or hormonal, developmental, social, or cultural aspects that can influence sexual orientation. No direct findings have emerged to permit scientists to conclude that its sexual orientation is determined by any particular factor. Many think of nature and nurture as both play complex roles in sexual orientation, being that you're born a certain way, or that certain experiences when you were young could help to influence your sexual orientation, being trauma when you're younger, role models, exposure to different experiences. But regardless, most people experience little choice about their sexual orientation. Now, is homosexuality a mental disorder? This has been of large debate in our culture over many years. There has been history of famous painters that have been rumored to be homosexual, and how that influenced the way they were viewed in society has been changed throughout the years as well. So, firstly, no. Gay, lesbian, bisexual orientations are not disorders. Research has found no inherent association between sexual orientation and psychopathology. Both heterosexual behavior and homosexual behavior are normal aspects of human sexuality. Both have been documented in different cultures and historical eras. Therefore, the mainstream organizations long ago abandoned classification as homosexuality as a mental disorder. So the first psychological test to determine whether there was any kind of biological explanation for homosexuality was not until 1957 by scientist Karen Hooker. Because of her research, she concluded that the sexuality was not based on environmental factors, as people of different environments of different sexual orientations perform similarly to psychological tests. And in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association actually removed homosexuality from its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders. And then in 1975, they released a public statement stating that homosexuality is not a mental disorder. Before this change in it being described as a mental disorder, have before then and after experienced a lot of prejudice or discrimination, and it can have a lot of social impacts and personal impacts to those people. On a social level, prejudice and discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, anything that's not heterosexual can be reflected in everyday stereotypes in members of these groups. These stereotypes can persist even though they are not supported by evidence, but they can also limit these people not only in social contexts, with interactions between one another. It can have negative experiences or be dismissed before they're getting to know, but also in everyday life limitations when it comes to job opportunities, parenting, relationship recognition, are often justified by stereotype assumptions that about gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. We tend to gender these relationships based off of the heteronormative that we know so well in our culture. For instance, a gay couple or lesbian couple, you often hear the question, well, who's the man in the relationship or who's the woman, as opposed to knowing that these are both men or both women. We have to kind of, to make it make sense in our society, we have to relate it to our heteronormative idea. And lastly, we have the topic of gender. So in Western cultures, we have our traditional gender binary of male and female. However, all throughout today's age in different cultures, they can respect and identify different genders in their society. For instance, we have the Berdates, or the Two-Spirit. These are third or fourth genders found in over 150 Native American cultures. These people are well understood and incorporated into the society in a respectful manner. In some cultures, they're even questioned to be part of divine intervention. So these people are recognized just as normally as male or female as we would in our culture. And these are biological men who identify as women. Next, we have sworn virgins. These are women who choose not to marry and to live as men in cultures in Albania. So this often is brought about by social aspects where there's not enough men in the family. For instance, if a family has 3 daughters and they need a man to help tied to certain gender roles, one might transform into a sworn virgin. So sworn virgins are generally accepted amongst the male community and are able to obtain rights as the same as men in the eyes of the country. For instance, women cannot drive, but if a woman were to become a sworn virgin, they would now have the ability to drive. They also adapt traditional gender roles, such as the appearance of men, including masculine dress or haircuts as seen in this photo here, and occupations such as in labor. And although these people are very accepting of this transition of gender, they do have their own ideals about relationships. So for instance, in Albania, they only recognize male or female relationships, making lesbianism a foreign and disgraced concept. If a woman were to become a sworn virgin in Albania, they do declare celibacy and choose not to marry. But for instance, if a woman were to decide to be with another woman, that would be a disgrace. So this just goes to show how different cultures can view one cultural aspect that we find foreign as totally normal, but then other aspects like different sexual orientations as still not acceptable. Lastly, we have the Hydra, which is a third gender in many Indian societies, and it consists of men taking on the appearance and gender roles of women. These people are believed by many Indians to possess certain abilities to either bless or curse people. They often are seen as living taboo lives. They are invited to weddings in order to bless the bride and groom or perform and sing and dance, but they're not as generally accepted in the society, but they are recognized as a separate aspect of men and women. In Western culture, we have seen some gender variants. For instance, cisgendered, which is what typically we accept here, is defined as a person who identifies with their gender identity as the same as their biological sex and associated gender that they were assigned at birth. For instance, if you were born with female body parts, you were born associated with being a female, and on the inside I feel like a female, so I would be a cisgendered woman. However, in recent media we've seen many transgender women come out, for instance with Caitlyn Jenner, and transgender is defined as a person whose gender identity contradicts their biological sex and associated gender at birth. There's also another category called non-binary, in which a person's gender does not identify with one or the other, not men or a woman. And I don't have a picture here because they can appear to be many different things because it doesn't conform to one side or the other. So with my research on sex, gender, and sexuality, I found a very interesting paper about how scientific evidence has begun to undermine the gender binary, and I wanted to share with you a couple of aspects from that paper there. So firstly, discuss how the gender binary assumes a couple of things. One, that it's a dimorphic system, meaning it can be one thing or the other. We also assume that the gender binary is genetically determined, that it is fixed and not changing, and that it's internally consistent. The leading scientists on this research looked into the differences in the human brain between men and women and how it can vary. One example is, for instance, the intermediate nucleus in the human hypothalamus is about twice as large on average for men than it is for women. However, 30% of men have a size of the nucleus that falls into the range of females. So this just shows that between men and women, the differences that we commonly see are not internally consistent. Not every man and not every woman has its own classified dimorphic system. Next, the paper highlighted how sexual differences in brain features can vary greatly depending on environmental conditions and that they're context dependent. For instance, they did a study on the cannabinoid receptors in rat hippocampuses and the density of them. And typically, the density is higher in males. But after subjecting different gendered rats to 3 weeks of mild stress, they noticed that the sexual differences in that portion of the brain was reversed. For instance, the density of the receptors in the females after stress were the same as non-stressed males, and then after the 3 weeks of stress, the density of the receptors in stressed males were the same as non-stressed females. So this just shows that the sexual differences in the brain features of men and women, being in humans, rats, different animals, can show that it can change depending on environmental conditions. Lastly, the paper highlights the differences when it comes to hormones between men and women. So for instance, different levels in hormones can vary throughout a person's lifespan. And specifically, the paper highlighted how fetuses or prepubescent children can be categorized in the gender binary on the basis of androgen, male hormone, or estrogen, female hormone. This is because during adolescence, their levels are very, very similar, and especially for testosterone levels, testosterone being the typically male hormone, that being that it's higher in males, that defines the difference between men and women. During adolescence, testosterone is increased in both boys and girls, commonly higher in boys, but there is some overlap where boys have found to have testosterone levels more similar to the range that's acceptable for females. Some females have higher testosterone levels that mimic those of boys. So if hormones are such a defining factor between gender, then how can we put children that have the same hormones until puberty into that kind of roles? There's also a lot of variation in women during the reproductive process. For instance, non-pregnant women have levels of estradiol and progesterone much more similar to men than they do to pregnant women. Also, social factors and heritability influence levels of testosterone throughout a person's lifetime. For instance, a woman experiencing sexual thoughts can have increased testosterone levels, or fathers-to-be have shown to have decreased testosterone levels. And these just counter the notion that testosterone is fixed and that it highlights behavioral context. Lastly, this paper highlighted meta-analysis of gender roles in terms of behavior, in which they surveyed hundreds of college students all across the United States about 10 highly gender stereotyped behaviors, such as self-care or sports. And what they found was that less than 1% of the subjects exhibited only feminine or only masculine behaviors. So what we can conclude from this research is that gender, in terms of the brain, in terms of hormones or behaviors of men and women, are not dimorphic, and they're not internally consistent. And so this research tends to undermine the traditional gender binary. Lastly, we're going to discuss sex. So sex variance is biologically determined by genitalia, hormones, and chromosomes. So we're going to talk about how these things cannot all align sometimes, how that affects society's viewpoint of a person's sex, and what outcomes can have for those individuals. Firstly, for genitalia, we have the male reproductive system on the left and the female reproductive system on the right. And we can first talk about how these tend to form. So here we have a photo of an embryo. In the first few weeks of contraception, the human embryo develops the ability to form either ovaries or testes. And so any variation during this developmental process, whether it be from different levels of hormones or exposure to external substances like drugs or alcohol from the mother, can result in a sex that falls outside of the traditional binary. Here we have a spectrum in terms of intersex individuals. This shows on the left a penis and on the right a vagina and all the different variations in between that can happen with variations in hormones. So given the number of mutations and variations that occur in the construction of each human body, there is significant scientific evidence that shows that sex can extend beyond the binary of simply male or female. Intersex is a condition caused by varying levels of testosterone that occur once in every 1,500 births, so kind of more common than you might think. Excess or insufficient quantities of testosterone in utero can affect a person's cross-sex development. For instance, biological boys in terms of chromosomes will begin to develop as biological girls in the absence of sufficient testosterone in utero. Body parts relating to sex, such as breasts, penis, labia, gonads, all vary in shape, size, and morphology. However, in human cultures, sex categories are simplified to male, female, or sometimes intersex in order to simplify social interactions. Here we have a couple of examples about how hormones and genitalia can affect a person's sex and how they're viewed in society. We have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH, and this is when a genetically female individual is born with ambiguous genitalia. Or we have androgen insensitivity syndrome, in which a person that is genetically male, meaning they have XY chromosomes, they're resistant to androgens, which is the male hormone. This is where if an intersex child is born, they would have a corrective surgery to align the genitalia with either male or female. Hormone variation can also have effect on the development of secondary sex characteristics, being breasts, distribution of body hair, skeletal form, and they play a large role in traditional gender expectations of how a man or a woman should appear. Through gender reassignment surgeries, individuals take hormones such as testosterone or estrogen, and the effects that they have on the body for a man to begin to grow breasts or to have difference in its aggression levels. Just show the malleability of gender norms and expectations when it comes to variations in hormone level. For instance, if a person has male genitalia but have a higher level of female hormones, where does that line end between a male or a female? Lastly, talking about the sex variants in chromosomes, determining biological sex can complicate even further when it comes to a person's anatomy not matching their sex chromosomes. An individual's sex is theoretically determined by two sex chromosomes, one from the mother and one from the father. Receiving an X chromosome from the mother and an X from the father would result in a female, an X from the mother and a Y from the father would result in a male. So there are, however, variations in cases where individuals do not simply have an XX or an XY set of sex chromosomes. Turner syndrome, for example, is where an individual has only inherited one sex chromosome, the X from the mother. In this instance, the individual's apparent sex is female. However, the ovaries are often defective or absent, and there's no pubertal development and no menstrual cycle. Klinefelter syndrome is a case where an individual has an XXY set of sex chromosomes. Their internal and external genitals are male, however, the testes are very small or absent, and they do not produce sperm. These individuals often experience reduced sex drive as well. An XXY syndrome here is an appropriate name for individuals with XXY sex chromosomes. These individuals often show signs of impulsive behavior and may have reduced sperm production to the point of sterility. So these cases all just come together to question the traditional binary of male and female. To show how these variations in chromosomes are affected in our culture, I want to talk today about mandatory sex tests that female athletes who compete in international competitions are required to undergo. For instance, a person may appear female, but if they have male sex chromosomes, they could be disqualified from those competitions. It's not fair to have men and female compete against each other on the same sport. Some athletes have even been disqualified as they did not pass the sex test. And that just goes to show how our culture does view chromosomes, genitalia, and hormones as different types that define someone's sex. Okay, so what does this all mean? We have variations in gender all over the world and throughout history, different definitions of sexuality, of whether it's accepted or not, how it defines a person's gender or sex and if they're related, and also variations in sex when it comes to hormones, chromosomes, and genitalia. So our society's view of gender and sex as a consistent binary, man or woman, is undermined by empirical evidence. And where do we draw the line between male and female when it comes to the different aspects that can define such? In conclusion, there is likely not more people that stray from the binary, but a time that allows for them to be heard. As our culture as a whole strays from past ideals like strong influences from religion, I imagine that our society will become even more open and inclusive and more broadly defined. So thank you for watching my presentation, and I look forward to your questions. Bye.